This will be a video on the maintenance of the extractor system for the match gun MG2 target pistols. And the first thing you're going to need is some different tools and materials. In terms of materials, you're going to need regular cleaning supplies, cotton swabs, toothpicks, patches. You're going to need some kind of thin, stiff piece. This is plastic. A piece of cardboard will work. In terms of lubrication and cleaning, any good CLP will work. I happen to like Shooter's Choice FP10. Lubrication, I use the Slide Glide Light. That's a nice thin sticky grease that tends to stay put. In terms of tools, you're going to need a small punch. This one has a nice short stiff tip on it, so it's unlikely to bend or break, and it needs to be a 16th inch punch will work nicely. You're going to need a mallet of some sort, and I also, to make life easier, it's not essential if you have a regular bench block. This is a 3D printed bench block specifically designed to work with the slide and the extractor, and I will include a link in the description to Thingiverse files to get one of these printed up if you have a printer or know somebody who has a printer. One of the things that you'll need to reassemble things is a dummy pin to hold everything in place. And one of the features of the bench block is that it has a place to store a dummy pin. This is made from a small finishing nail, and there's again a description of that in the Thingiverse file. So those are all the things that you're going to need to work on the slide and the extractor. Once you have all your tools and materials handy, step one is to take the system apart, and we'll use the bench block for that. And the pin that retains the extractor is in the rear right corner, and that has to be driven from the bottom out the top. And you don't actually have to drive it all the way out, you just have to get it down far enough so that it's no longer holding the spring in place. This one's been taken apart several times, so the pin comes out fairly easily. On a brand new slide, they're staked pretty well on top, and you may have to whale on it a little bit to get that free the first few times. And what you want to do is you want to park your finger over the back end of the slide before you remove the pin punch, and that prevents the spring from sailing across the room. So the spring comes out, and then the ball bearing comes out, and then the extractor comes out. So that's the disassembly process. The next step is cleaning. It's pretty much like any other gun part assembly. You want to get all of the carbon and dirt, unburned powder, and everything else out of the system. Wipe down the extractor, make sure that there's nothing sticking on that. This one actually hasn't seen a lot of use since the last time I had it apart. And the thing that's critical in the cleaning, aside from just making sure that the extractor can move freely, is that there's a slot that the extractor pivots in, and if you get fouling built up on this portion of the extractor in the slot, then the extractor can't pivot as far over to the left as it should. And eventually, if enough dirt builds up in there, and you happen to have a slightly undersized case, it cannot hang on to it properly, and that's going to give you a jam. So once you get the extractor cleaned up, what I use to clean the slot is the piece of plastic that I mentioned earlier, and basically fold a patch over the plastic piece and then sort of sweep it through the slot, and that gives you a good way to get the crud out of there. You can also use like an aerosol cleaner. So once everything's cleaned, we'll go on to reassembling. So once we have everything cleaned, it's time to put it back together again. And in the process of doing that, you want to lubricate the pieces. The extractor itself, I like to put some CLP oil on the top and the bottom where the extractor swings in the slot in the slide. And there are 3 locations where there's sort of high force and contact that I like to use the grease, the slide glide grease. And if you put a bit on the end of a toothpick, the places that I like to use it is the back of the lever, because that's where the ball bearing rubs, and further back on the outside of the extractor, which is where the retaining pin hits the extractor, and also what I call the front of the foot, which is this area here, and that's where the extractor sits and pivots in the slot in the slide. So once that's all lubricated, it goes back in the slot. You want to make sure it's fully down so that you can get the other parts in. The next item is the ball bearing, and you can actually sort of pick that up with a bit of grease on the tube of grease and get that started in the hole, and then push it down with a toothpick. And for the spring, what I like to do is I'll park it on the end of a toothpick so I don't lose it, and then put some of the CLP oil on the spring and insert it down into the hole, and get your toothpick out. Now at this point the spring is sticking out past the retaining pin, and what you need to do is to use the dummy pin from the bottom, and you want to hold that lightly in place, and then use the pin punch in the slot on the right side of the slide to push the spring down until you can get that dummy pin all the way across so that it's retaining the spring. And you want to get your thumb on it so it doesn't fly out, and then tap the retaining pin into place. And again, this one's been worked on a number of times, so it goes in pretty easy. Once it's flush on top, the spring is fully retained. You can take out the dummy pin, and then you want to seat it below flush, and the other end of the bench block has a support for the rear of the slide, and you just take your punch and it'll kind of snap down past where that staking is located, and you're back in business.